Good morning, folks, and thanks to Alex and the Creative Mornings for having Thorne Ferguson and myself here to share a bit of our lives and what we're doing to work with wood in this craft morning, and how that extends to allowing wood to work for all of us. So basically, my name is Steve Burnett. I'm based here in Edinburgh. I've got a workshop in Haymarket, and for 25 years now I've been fashioning wood, sustainable wood, usually branches, actually trying to keep trees alive still, to give trees a chance. My motto and Thorne's motto is to give trees a voice. And by taking a branch you save an incredible gentle giant and one of the lungs of the earth, which is our prime concern, being environmentalists. So it started for me when I was a kid. I'm not that old, but you know, when I was a kid, there weren't many technical gadgets about, so a lot of us kids in those days ran about in woods, being brought up outside the city. And the image behind you there is very typical of the wood, where some of the early inspiration that we all know of when you're in a wood, you get that incredible primeval sense of energy. And that's where that transmitted to, you know, the sapling. I like to think there's a sapling in every one of us, and that little ring in the middle that we all grow around. And so my influence was very much in the middle of a wood, surrounded by birdsong and nature. And at that point, with a penknife, I started to inadvertently shape branches and twigs. And so then went on. A few years later, many of us in those days in secondary school were given the poems of Wilfred Owen, who, for anyone who has never heard of him, he was a First World War poet. And like many of those lads and lassies 100 years ago, he died at 25 in the last stages of the war, 4 days before Armistice. He died, in fact, this November the 4th. Exactly 100 years ago. And for me, I fell in love with his poetry and was horrified by the war poetry that he wrote. But I actually fell in love with one of the early poems that he wrote in 1910. And it's called Written in a Wood, September 1910. And I think inadvertently again, that had a large effect on how I approached wood. At that time I wasn't doing violin making, but I'll read you this poem which had a huge effect on subsequent violins I was going to make, and also allow this tree to become a fulcrum in influencing schools and communities to think about the ultimate sacrifice that so many youngsters gave back in the First World War, and the horrors and utter disgust of wars that are continuing to this day, 100 years on. So this is a poem written by a 17-year-old romantic, Wilfred Owen, and his testament to nature and to the power of nature and renewal, and had a huge effect on my creativity. So it's called Written in the Wood, September 1910 by Wilfred Owen. Full 90 autumns had this ancient beech helped with its myriad leafy tongues to swell the dirges of the deep-toned western gale. And 90 times hath all its power of speech been stricken dumb at sound of winter's yell. Since Adonais, no more strong and hale, might have rejoiced to linger here and teach his thoughts in sonnets to the listening dell, or glide in fancy through those leafy grots and bird pavilions hung with arras green, to hear the sonnets of its minstrel choir. 90 times again, when autumn rots, shall birds and leaves be mute and all unseen. Yet shall I see fair Keats and hear his lyre. So that was Wilfred Owen, a 17-year-old romantic. Little did he know that 4 years later, one of the worst wars in the history of humanity was going to strike Europe. And even in this, there was analogies and metaphors alluding to the leaves of the trees being the lads that were to be ultimately sacrificing themselves, and stricken dumb by the sound of the deep-toned western gale. That to me was the Western Front, and stricken dumb was the symptoms of shell shock, which leads me on to the next part of my life. In that, in 2014, I'd been looking for years and years for a tree that had some kind of connection to Wilfred Owen, so I could give my personal tribute to a great hero and someone who we've all got, if nothing else from today, you've got to go away and read the warnings of Wilfred Owen and help put these warnings out there for everyone to understand that this man didn't die in vain. And I finally found a branch in a tree at Craiglockhart here in Edinburgh, which was a former shell shock hospital where Wilfred Owen in 1917 was to meet another great literary figure, Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, three English writers who had a great impact on one another. And the three of them in 1917 wrote some of the most powerful war poetry or anti-war poetry and other literature. Sassoon and Graves went on to live after the war. And so this violin, I managed to get a branch from this tree at the 11th hour, and I made a violin called the Wilfred Owen violin, which was finished just before the exact centenary of the outbreak of First World War in 1914. And it was played at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was marked by the Royal Shakespeare Company's a Christmas truce, and then went on, where I then met my partner here and colleague, Thorne Ferguson, who's a very fine musician and actor, and the two of us partnered up together, taking the message from this violin, this humble violin, out and about. And since then, the violin was endorsed by one of the finest living players on the planet, Maxim Vengerov, who's more importantly a UNICEF ambassador. And that, for me and Thorne, is so important that so many children, women and children, are caught up in this terrible battles and wars. Just look at Syria just now, just breaks our hearts that, you know, in this 21st century, that governments, I don't know why, I'm not going into politics here, but I think we've all got an understanding of why these wars are going on. But the ones that lose in all this are the kids and the women, and that's why this violin is now an envoy for peace and reconciliation through the power of music, and it's in the spirit of Wilfred Owen. There's another picture. That's when the violin was first completed, by the pictures by an amazing photographer, Jane Barlow. If you look at the BBC website today, she's just done a beautiful capture of the moment when an osprey catches a trout. But Jane Barlow hopefully will do a talk here at some stage, and she's a remarkable photographer. And so she's been on board with other violins I've made from other trees. For Conan Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle was honoured with the Sherlock violin back in 2009, and other violins from historic trees, branches to historic figures. But anyway, Thorne and I went on taking the violin up and down the country. Thorne in 2015, wrote, this is 4 years of working this project, by the way. Well, it's not a project, it's a commemoration tribute, but he, as Thorne can tell you himself, as a player in the Highland tradition, he feels that instruments, well, I'm a great believer as well, that they pass energy from the tree that they've picked up from the historic moments when these individuals are around them. That kinetic energy travels through the maker into the wood, and then finally is released through the player who picks up energies and is able to hear and understand tunes from, in the folk tradition, from a bit of wood. And so he very quickly picked up tunes for the lads of Quentin's Hill. In 1915 there was a disaster in Gretna Green, the worst rail disaster in British rail history, where 216 boys from the Royal Scots, you know, people talk about men going to war, they were boys, for goodness sake, 17 years old and younger, and they were on their way, and there was a 3-train pile-up where 260 of them, 16 of them were killed, and then after that the remaining survivors were then put on another train, taken to Liverpool and embarked for Gallipoli for their final fate. So Thorne wrote a beautiful tune, The Lads of Quentin's Hill, which was played at the official commemoration in Dreghorn, where we've got a commemoration wood for 216 trees, again, a tree to a tree, which will produce eventually a beautiful forest where people can wander about and listen to the nature, which will bring back. And then we went on to the Somme and other events in between. just highlighting and tribute to these dreadful battles and losses. So basically, it's an envoy for peace, and there's another 2 violins, the Sassoon violin and the Robert Graves, and the 3 of them are doing their rounds, which will bring me on to the final tribute, which is happening this year, is Armistice, which is a piece that Thorn has composed, a beautiful piece that has just had coverage in the newspapers yesterday, the media, and he's constructed a world orchestra, and through the internet and media, he's going to have an orchestra from around the world. For anyone who wants to participate will get his music that he's composed from his website, and then they can all participate. I'll let him tell you more about that on Armistice Day, this 11th of November. So everyone can participate at any level you are in music, and everyone can play for peace and reconciliation. All started with this Back to the Tree. So there's another one of the violin in his workshop when it was first played. This is a project when Neil McLennan, he's a historian that's another colleague we work with, and he discovered that the 3 poets actually met historically in one of the golf courses just outside Edinburgh. And that was, believe it or not, one of the most important literary meetings of the 20th century. So Neil and Thorn and myself have been together with these projects heading towards Armistice for lasting peace, hopefully. Now, the other aspect that we're both very passionate about is the plight of the sea. And although it's out of sight, out of mind, we all know from David Attenborough's warnings this year that the seas are really struggling. Now, 10 years ago, I put on a concert with the Marine Conservation Society called the Concert for the Sea. And that was with the Sherlock Violin, which supports local and international children's and environmental charities. And we had a big concert with school children who did their own poetry, paintings, and what the sea meant for them. And then we had, with the marine conservation and experts in marine conservation, gave their own talk as part of that event. And for 20 years, I've been looking for a bit of driftwood on every beach walk I've done. I was hoping that it would be suitable for making a violin that would stand up for the seas and as part of the environmental concerns. And it was only 2 years ago I was on a walk with one of my sons down in Gullen Beach in East Lothian, and lo and behold, there was a big tree trunk, and it was a poplar tree trunk, and I could just sense, as a stone sculptor can sense as a statue within a bit of sandstone, I could sense there was a violin sitting within that log. So I got down there with my saw and sized it up. Unfortunately, most of it was cracked open and woodworm, but I managed to get one piece of wood. And only a few weeks ago, it was released officially, a violin called Ilmari violin. And this violin here is a voice. It's been endorsed by the Marine Conservation as a voice from and for the sea. So we've now got a violin from a tree that stands for peace. And this violin is an official ambassador for world oceans and the protections. And to add an extra dimension, our motto as well is where music takes over, where words finish. So this violin will be played by Thorn, who's again the player and the supporter of the same project for the environment. This violin, it was launched on World Oceans Day, which we were thrilled about. It's already appeared at 2 official World Ocean events. It's going to be travelling around the world. Now it's been launched back to the land. It's done a huge amount of journeying in the sea. The piece of wood was well sculpted by the sea's hand, and you could see that it was remarkably, it picked up a lot of energy from the sea in its travels. And so this is going to be travelling to communities and schools and official events around the world as part of its journey now in taking the message on. Now, there's a lot of metaphors in this violin as well. It belongs to the world of Neptune from Greek mythology, Ilmari being the Latin name for the sea, or the modern Italian name. Neptune wasn't just the god of underworld and the sea, he was also the god of fresh water in Roman world. So this piece of wood came from a bit of sycamore that was lying at the banks of the water of Leith. And the front came from a piece of wood from way up in the Italian mountains. So we've got for the children and for other people who are interested in a connection, we've now got the water cycle. from the sea to the mountains, down the rivers. And not only that, it doesn't finish there, but we all know the terrible plight of the oldest species on the planet, the 40-million-year-old whales, who are now ingesting terrible plastics, thinking they're squid and other food sources, and they're all being found now with stuffed to the gunnels with plastic. Well, this has got an ancient varnish on it, which I made from amber, fossilized amber that was collected from the Baltic coastlines, and fossilized amber that goes back 40 million years to the ancient forests that stood before any of us were around. And at that point, when these forests were growing, these trees were growing, the whale was in its infancy as a species that was related to other animals like the hippopotamus, and it was a four-legged amphibian. And that was just finding its way into the sea at that point, 40 million years ago, and this varnish comes from that same landscape. So that had to be melted in a crucible at such high temperatures you could melt metal, and then it was put in with linseed oil. So anyway, this violin is now an envoy for the sea, and Thorin in a wee while will be giving you a chance to hear the voice of the sea. So there's a picture of Thorin on World Oceans Day, taken again by Jane Barlow, and Thorin's also an actor. And he went over and above the call of duty there by wading in as far as he was commanded on quite a chilly day, actually. But he's a windsurfer, and he was born in New Zealand, and wherever he's gone, he's always got to go to the sea. So, when he's not on land, you'll find him somewhere down Portobello or doing some kind of sea activity. So it's a great honour to be working together with the Marine Conservation. And finally, there's that incredible ocean that we all know so well, and that I think, if nothing else, if after this we could all maybe come together, and I think these kind of talks are amazing, that we can all get a chance to share our love for our environment and what we can all do. We believe both that environmental protection and respect for others all starts on your own doorstep, and your respect for nature starts in your own garden by planting out the right plants. You get the bees, which bring the pollinators, the insects in, the birds come back. So if nothing else from today, it's about giving trees a voice through some unique instruments that can allow trees to speak up for this fragile environment and rebuild the damage that we've caused with neglect and not thinking it out, and re-establish and stop the terrible deforestation that's going on and the dumping of oceans litter. Because I really feel that we're all standing on the branch, and we're 3/4 of the way through, and that's coming from a woodworker, environmentalist. And if I can see it, we can all see it. But there's nothing sadder than any language you look at than the words "too late." And let's face it, we've got an incredible jewel in the universe that we all know and love. Forget space exploration. We know we're living in the most incredible planet, and every day you get up, I say this to my kids, don't ever take anything for granted. A bird song, because that is not going to last forever. And it's up to us to turn the tide and bring back the health of the planet so that our future generations can live in a peaceful, beautiful environment where everyone, no matter what colour or creed you are, we all get together and we live together in this beautiful wonderment of planet Earth. Anyway, thanks very much. And in a minute, you'll hear Thorin Ferguson.
How much time have we got? 1 minute. 4 minutes. Hi folks, I'm going to play this driftwood violin, Eomari. If you want at the end, come up and have a look at it. It's a beautiful, it's a stunning violin. Come and have a look at it. People always want to touch it and feel it. It's got a lovely sort of feel. It's very sort of, with craft, everyone wants to come up and sort of touch things. So come up and say hello to us, come up and see the violin. I'm going to play hopefully 2 tunes if we've got time. First one is a well-known Scottish tune related to the sea. torn as to what to play next.
You can keep playing.
I can keep playing. Okay, fine. Okay, so if anyone needs to leave, that's fine. We won't feel offended. The first tune I'm going to play is something a bit more upbeat. Okay, I'll play a couple of jigs, Scottish, Irish jigs. Sea shanty. It's called Shannon. It's quite a famous tune. You've maybe heard it before. So sea shanties were working songs, and they were always for a particular purpose. They had different shanties for different purposes. So some were for like raising sails, bigger sails, smaller sails. This one that I'm going to play is a capstan shanty. The capstan was like a bollard in the middle of the boat that had holes through it that they put two big sort of oak.
Shafts.
Was that?
Shafts.
Yeah, like two big sort of trunks of oak through the middle of it. You probably know better than this. Okay, so anyway, and they had sort of four on them, and all the sailors would sort of heave this round to a particular time, and that's what the shanty was for, was to get the timing right. And that was for things like raising the anchor or the biggest sails. And this one, Shenandoah, was special because it was only played when the ship was either coming into port or leaving. So, and because of that, it had a real strong emotional significance to the sailors, and it was never sung outside of that time. A couple of weeks ago, me and Steve met a man in Edinburgh whose grandfather compiled a book of all the sea shanties, because it was an oral tradition, nobody had ever written them down. And he sang them to a music student in New York many, many years ago, and she wrote them down. So this is Shenandoah.